In the summer of 2012, two tourists stepped into the forest trails of a national park and were never seen again. 10 years later, only one returned, carrying a secret so chilling it threatened to unravel everything the town thought it knew. The morning air was cool and thin as Daniel and Marcus drove their old car into the entrance of the national park. The sky stretched wide and pale, the kind of blue that promised both warmth and danger depending on how long you stayed under it. They had been talking for weeks about making this trip, about leaving behind the noise of the city and spending days among the trees where phones lost their signal and time felt slower. As the ranger at the gate handed them a map and a folded brochure, both men smiled like children about to begin a new game. They had no idea that by the end of that day, the world would remember their names for something far darker. The road wound deeper into the park, climbing between tall ridges and wide meadows dotted with wildflowers. Marcus pointed out shapes in the rock that looked like faces, while Daniel laughed and teased him for always trying to find patterns. When they pulled over at a scenic overlook, the forest stretched endlessly below, a dark green carpet rolling toward the horizon. It was beautiful, but there was something heavy about it too, as though the trees had been standing guard for longer than anyone could count. Neither of them said it aloud, but both felt it. They parked near the main trailhead, a small dirt lot where a few other cars were already sitting in the shade. The wooden signs gave directions to waterfalls, cliffs, and hidden lakes. Daniel unfolded the map, tracing a thin line that led away from the popular spots and into the quieter part of the park. He wanted silence, a path not crowded with families or groups of campers. Marcus agreed, though he admitted that the thought of being deep in the wilderness made him uneasy. Daniel smiled and told him that adventure always required a little fear. The first part of the hike was easy. Sunlight fell in patches through the branches and the air smelled faintly of pine and damp soil. They joked about who would last longer if they got lost, each trying to sound more confident than the other. Birds called overhead, and a deer darted across the trail so quickly that Marcus nearly dropped his backpack. By the second hour, they were far from the parking lot, the sounds of people replaced by a silence that was complete, broken only by the crunch of their boots. It was Marcus who first noticed the odd carving on a tree near a bend in the path. The mark looked like a circle with uneven lines drawn through it, not quite natural, not quite like anything official either. He touched the rough bark and frowned. Daniel shrugged it off, suggesting it was just some teenager trying to scare hikers. Still, as they walked on, they both found themselves glancing back at that tree more than once. By afternoon, the trail narrowed, the ground sloping downward into thicker forest. The map did not show much detail, and at one point Daniel stopped, confused about which direction was correct. The signpost nearby had fallen, broken at the base, its arrow missing. The air seemed heavier here, cooler, though the sun was still high. Marcus asked if they should turn back, but Daniel insisted they had plenty of time before nightfall. He promised the path would open to a clearing soon, where they could rest. They moved forward, their voices quieter than before, their laughter fading as the shadows grew long. Somewhere in the endless trees, the forest listened. Neither man noticed how the sounds of birds had gone silent, or how even the breeze seemed to have stopped moving. All they knew was that they had finally arrived, and that the adventure they wanted was waiting, hidden just beyond the next bend. The trail narrowed as Daniel and Marcus left the open sky behind and stepped deeper into the forest. The pines grew taller here, rising like pillars, their dark branches blotting out much of the light. The air changed as they walked, cooler and stiller, carrying the faint smell of sap and earth. The cheerful mood they had carried from the parking lot began to fade into something quieter. They did not speak as much now, their footsteps pressing into the soft carpet of needles that muffled nearly every sound. It was as though the forest was swallowing their voices, leaving only the distant creak of branches and the whisper of unseen animals. Marcus was the first to notice how quickly the world behind them seemed to disappear. When he turned, the trail they had followed already looked unfamiliar, swallowed by the thick line of trees. He pointed this out to Daniel, half joking that if they did not watch the map more closely, they would be wandering until winter. Daniel waved him off, insisting that the trail markers would keep them safe. But even as he spoke, he glanced around with a small crease in his brow, as though he too sensed how quickly the woods could make a person feel lost. The deeper they went, the fewer signs of other hikers remained. No discarded water bottles, no footprints in the dirt, not even the faint murmur of people ahead or behind them. Daniel liked it that way, enjoying the quiet, but Marcus felt unsettled. He noticed how the forest seemed to lean inward, trees crowding the path until it felt like walking through a tunnel. Light fell only in narrow stripes that shifted when the wind moved the branches. Shadows slid across the trail in shapes that looked alive when caught at the corner of the eye. After an hour, they reached a small clearing where the sun broke through. Daniel dropped his pack and sat on a flat rock to drink some water. Marcus stood nearby, looking at the line of trees that surrounded them. He felt as though the clearing was not a safe resting spot but a stage, the dark woods watching from every side. He said nothing to Daniel, afraid his friend would laugh, but he could not shake the thought. When they continued, the trail grew rougher. Fallen logs blocked their way and the ground dipped into shallow gullies filled with damp moss. At one point Daniel tripped on a root and caught himself with a sharp laugh, brushing off dirt from his palms. He said that no wonder so few hikers came this way, and Marcus reminded him that maybe there was a reason. They both smiled at the comment, but the laughter was forced, short-lived. It was late afternoon when they came upon another mark on a tree, much like the strange carving they had seen earlier. This one was deeper, fresher, the lines cut sharply into the bark. Marcus bent close, frowning. The shape resembled a circle again, with crooked lines running across it, but it was larger and darker, the edges rough as if carved with hurried strength. Daniel said quickly that it must have been made by hunters or campers, someone wanting to leave their mark, but neither of them fully believed it. As they pressed forward, the forest grew thicker still. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp soil. The sun dipped low, light struggling through the tall trunks. The silence deepened until even their footsteps seemed too loud, echoing between the trees. By then, both men had stopped joking altogether. The adventure had begun to feel less like a simple hike, and more like a crossing into some hidden part of the world, a place where the rules of time and distance were quietly different. The sun had dipped lower in the sky by the time Daniel and Marcus reached the old ranger outpost. The building sat on the edge of the clearing like a forgotten relic, its roof sagging, its windows clouded with dust and moss. A crooked sign leaned against the doorframe, the letters almost too faded to read. Marcus paused, shifting his backpack on his shoulder, and remarked that it looked like something out of another time. Daniel, always more curious than cautious, walked right up to the door and tried the handle. It rattled but did not open. The place seemed locked in silence, untouched for years. Two hikers approached from the opposite side of the trail, while Daniel and Marcus lingered near the outpost. A woman in a red jacket called out a friendly greeting, asking if they had found the right path to the lake. Daniel lifted the map and pointed them in the right direction. The strangers chatted briefly, long enough to remember their faces, and then went on their way. Later, when questions were asked, that woman would recall seeing the two men clearly. She would remember Daniel's laugh and Marcus studying the old building with unease. It was the last time anyone outside the forest laid eyes on them together. Daniel suggested circling around the back of the outpost, wondering if there might be another way inside. He liked the idea of exploring forgotten places, and he said that maybe they would find old supplies or notes left by rangers decades earlier. Marcus was reluctant, standing in the clearing with his hands on his hips, scanning the darkening line of trees. He could not shake the feeling that the forest was closing in around them. The light was softer now, casting the pines in long shadows that crept toward their boots. Eventually Marcus gave in and followed. They stepped carefully through tall grass and around rotting boards that had fallen from the side of the building. The back wall was almost completely covered in ivy, and there was no second door. Daniel touched the vines and pulled a few loose, but nothing more. Disappointed, he turned back, and they both stood for a moment in the quiet, staring at the outpost that seemed to breathe with the stillness of the woods. Marcus suggested again that they set up camp soon or return to the main path before dark. Daniel agreed half-heartedly, but his eyes lingered on the trees behind the building. A narrow game trail, almost hidden in the undergrowth, stretched into the forest. He pointed it out and said it might cut across toward the ridge. Marcus sighed but nodded. Neither wanted to argue, and both felt that sense of adventure still tugging at them. When the two men stepped into the shadows of that narrow path, the forest swallowed them whole. The clearing emptied, the old outpost settling back into its lonely watch. Hours later, when the hikers in the red jacket were questioned, they could only say that Daniel and Marcus had been alive and well, heading deeper into the woods, smiling as though the evening belonged to them. After that, there were no more sightings, no more voices carried on the wind, only silence, and the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the park for years to come. The alarm spread quickly once the two men were reported missing. When Daniel and Marcus did not return to their car that night, rangers checked the trailhead and found their vehicle still parked, dust beginning to gather on its hood. By morning, a search was organized. Volunteers from the nearby town arrived with flashlights, dogs, and canteens, while helicopters hovered overhead scanning the canopy for any sign of movement. The forest seemed endless from above, dark rivers of trees stretching beyond sight, swallowing everything in their shadows. For the first few days, hope was strong. The searchers spread across the park, calling the names of the missing men as they moved along ridges, streams, and valleys. At times, echoes bounced back through the trees, making it sound as if voices were answering, though none ever led to the hikers themselves. The dogs followed scents along the main path, only to lose them at the same point each time, a narrow stretch of ground where pine needles lay thick and undisturbed. The trainers tried again and again, but the trail always ended in the same place, as though the men had simply stepped off the earth. The rangers questioned campers and other visitors, and many reported nothing unusual. Only the couple in the red jacket remembered seeing Daniel and Marcus near the abandoned outpost. Their memory placed the men alive and well at that point, smiling and talking, with no sign of distress. From there, the details stopped. It was as if they had walked into a curtain that closed behind them. The search expanded wider, teams moving deeper into the wilderness. They marked trees with bright paint to avoid circling back, and at night their headlamps glowed like fireflies scattered across the ridges. Yet no matter how carefully they covered the land, nothing turned up beyond a few footprints, already blurred by rain. The prints showed only 2 sets of boots, side by side, until the ground hardened and the trail disappeared. Days became weeks. The volunteers grew weary, their calls hoarse, their hope dimming with each empty mile. Rumors began to circulate in town, whispered in shops and on porches. Some said the men had run away, others that they had stumbled into an abandoned mine, or that wild animals had dragged them off. The stories multiplied, but none fit the evidence, because there was so little evidence to shape. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. By the 3rd week, the official search was scaled back. Helicopters stopped flying, and only a handful of rangers still walked the trails. Families of the missing men visited the site, leaving flowers near the parking lot where the car remained. Daniel's parents stood quietly beside Marcus's brother, all of them staring into the forest as though the trees might at any moment release the truth. But the forest gave nothing back. Eventually, the case was closed as unresolved. The files were stored with others in a drawer marked with the word missing. The trail where the dogs lost the scent became a place visitors sometimes asked about, pointing it out on maps with curiosity, while locals avoided it altogether. With time, the memory of Daniel and Marcus faded from the daily news, settling into silence like pine needles falling slowly to the ground. Yet for those who had searched, the forest was never the same. They remembered the echo of their own voices, and the strange stillness that hung in the air, as if the trees themselves knew more than they would ever tell. It was early autumn when Daniel walked out of the forest again. The leaves near the edge of the national park had just begun to turn gold, and the air carried the first bite of cold. A truck driver spotted him first, stumbling along the roadside where the trees broke into open ground. The man pulled over, certain at first he was looking at a lost camper. But when Daniel raised his hand weakly, his face pale and thin, the driver realized this was something far stranger. Daniel had been gone for 10 years. The posters with his photograph had long since faded, his name whispered only in town when people told the story of the 2 hikers who never came back. Yet here he was, alive, wearing the same weathered jacket and boots he had worn the day he vanished. His beard was thin, his hair longer, but his face looked almost unchanged, as though time had passed in a different way for him than for everyone else. The driver asked where he had come from, but Daniel only shook his head and whispered that he needed water. At the nearest hospital, doctors crowded around him with questions. They checked his pulse, his weight, and ran test after test. He was dehydrated and weak, but otherwise healthy in a way that made no sense for someone missing a decade. His clothes, though frayed at the seams, showed no sign of years of wear. The rangers who arrived stood in stunned silence, staring at him like a ghost returned. They asked him about Marcus, about where he had been, about what had happened. Daniel only pressed his lips together, refusing to explain, his eyes fixed on some faraway thought. The news spread quickly. Reporters set up outside the hospital, and locals gathered in small groups whispering. Some believed it was a miracle. Others thought it was a cruel trick. Families who had lost their own loved ones in the park waited anxiously, hoping that if Daniel had returned, perhaps theirs might too. But Daniel gave them nothing, not even comfort. When asked about the missing, he would turn pale and shake his head. Detective Sarah Holloway was among the first to meet him. She had studied the original files years earlier, convinced that something about the disappearance of Daniel and Marcus tied into other unsolved cases. When she entered his hospital room, she found him sitting by the window, staring out at the tree line in the distance. He looked fragile, but there was something steady in his gaze. She introduced herself and promised she only wanted the truth. Daniel finally spoke then, but his words were soft, measured, and heavy with fear. He said Marcus had not come back with him. He did not say why, nor how. He said the forest had kept them, and that it was never meant to let go. His voice cracked as he said those words, and then he fell silent again, retreating into himself as though speaking too much might open a door he wanted closed. Sarah knew from that moment that the mystery was not over. It had only begun again with Daniel's return, and with the secret he carried back out of the pines. Daniel's return drew more attention than the hospital could handle. Reporters crowded outside, flashing cameras whenever an ambulance pulled into the lot, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had been gone for 10 years. Inside, the doctors and nurses worked quietly, keeping him away from the noise. They wanted answers too, but their concern was more immediate. They needed to understand how someone could walk out of the forest after a decade and show almost no signs of aging. He was kept in a private room on the 3rd floor. The blinds were drawn, and a guard sat in the hallway to keep the press away. Daniel lay on the bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, or sometimes turned toward the window, though the curtain blocked the view. He looked thin, his skin pale from years without sunlight, but his hair and face betrayed none of the time that had passed. The doctors whispered about it in the hallway, checking his charts as though each test might reveal the missing years. The questions came in steady waves. Where had he been? What had he eaten? How had he survived? Each time he gave an answer, it was vague or avoided entirely. He said he had lived on what the forest offered, but when asked to explain further, he turned quiet. When one doctor pressed harder, pointing out that his body showed no signs of long malnutrition, Daniel stared at the floor and would not respond at all. His silence became more unsettling than his words. At night, when the hospital quieted, the staff noticed he slept very little. He would sit upright, sometimes murmuring under his breath as though speaking to someone unseen. A nurse swore she heard him whisper Marcus's name. Another said he flinched at small sounds in the hallway, as though expecting something to follow him out of the trees. His unease spread to those around him. People left the room feeling colder than when they entered. Detective Sarah Holloway arrived with a folder of papers, determined to move beyond medical tests. She asked him about the day he vanished. He spoke softly at first, his eyes unfocused, describing the trail, the pines, and the way the air grew heavy. He mentioned Marcus once, saying only that they had gone together but had not returned together. When she pushed, asking directly where Marcus was, Daniel's expression hardened. He shook his head and said he could not tell her. Not that he would not, but that he could not. The doctors exchanged notes, struggling with the impossibility of his condition, while Sarah began to sense that the mystery was larger than anyone had imagined. Daniel remained an enigma, a man out of time, carrying a secret he seemed too frightened to share. Every question about those missing years circled back to silence, to the tightness in his jaw, and the way his eyes shifted toward the unseen line of trees beyond the window. Outside, the reporters shouted for updates. The town whispered about miracles and curses, and the families of other missing hikers clung to new hope. Inside, the hospital walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Daniel to speak. But each time the questions came, his answers broke down, leaving only fragments. It was as if the truth had followed him out of the forest but remained hidden just beyond his reach, a shadow he refused to name. Detective Sarah Holloway had followed the story of Daniel and Marcus for years. When she was a young officer, she had read the missing persons file, not as part of her duties but out of fascination with cases that seemed impossible. The file was thin, a collection of faded photographs, witness statements, and maps with red pencil marks that led nowhere. Over time, she had seen too many cases closed as unresolved, too many families left with nothing but silence. So when word spread that Daniel had reappeared, unchanged after a decade, she felt the weight of the old file rise again. This was her chance to see past the silence. She drove to the hospital on a gray afternoon, the kind of day when clouds seemed to hang just above the rooftops. Outside, the main entrance reporters huddled in clusters, waving microphones at anyone in uniform who passed. Sarah ignored them, flashing her badge to gain quick entry. Inside, the corridors were quiet except for the hum of machines and the muffled footsteps of staff. The atmosphere was tense, not only because a missing man had returned, but because no one could explain how. Doctors whispered about time itself, about how the body in that room showed years that never seemed to pass. Sarah stopped at the nurse's desk, giving her name and requesting access. The nurse studied her for a moment, then leaned closer and said softly that Daniel spoke little, and when he did it was in fragments, never full answers. Sarah thanked her and took the elevator up. On the 3rd floor, she met with the ranger who had handled the search 10 years earlier. His hair had gone white since then, his uniform pressed but tired at the edges. He admitted he could not believe Daniel was back. He told her again what he had told reporters, that the search had been thorough, that no sign of the men had ever been found, that the forest had given them nothing. His eyes held both relief and unease, as though Daniel's return unsettled him more than the disappearance had. Sarah nodded, making notes, her mind working through what she already knew. In her experience, vanished people did not simply walk out of the woods a decade later wearing the same boots and the same jacket. Something had held him, something that resisted explanation. When she was finally allowed into Daniel's room, she paused at the doorway. He sat by the window, shoulders thin under the hospital gown, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the curtain. He looked like a man who had been dropped into the wrong time, uncertain of where he belonged. She introduced herself gently, saying she was not there to judge, but to understand. He looked at her then, his expression distant but sharp, as if measuring whether she could be trusted. She asked only one question: where had he been all those years? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, his hands gripping the blanket. After a long silence, he whispered, "The forest keeps its own." Sarah leaned forward, her pulse quickening. She knew she had stepped onto the edge of something much larger, and that Daniel was the fragile key to it all. Detective Sarah Holloway sat across from Daniel in the small hospital interview room. The walls were plain, the blinds half drawn, and the clock ticked too loudly in the silence. Daniel sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, his posture stiff as though bracing for something. His eyes flicked toward the door now and then, and his shoulders lifted slightly at the sound of footsteps passing outside. Sarah had seen fear before, but this was something heavier, a fear that had grown roots and stayed with him for years. She started carefully, asking if he remembered the day he and Marcus entered the forest. Daniel nodded once, slowly. He said they had followed the trail, seen the old ranger outpost, and spoken with 2 other hikers. His voice was even, but his words were clipped short, as if each one cost him something. Sarah let the silence linger, waiting. After a pause, he added that they had taken a side path, one not marked on the map, because Daniel had thought it might cut across to the ridge. He admitted now that it had been his idea. When she asked what happened after, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His fingers tightened on the fabric of his gown. He said they kept walking, the forest growing darker even though the sun was still high. He described how the air felt thick and the sounds of birds had stopped. Then he trailed off, his jaw tightening. Sarah pressed gently, asking about Marcus. Daniel's expression changed at once, his eyes filling with something raw. He whispered that Marcus had not come back with him. Sarah leaned forward, asking where Marcus was, what had happened. Daniel shook his head, his gaze fixed on the table between them. He said Marcus had been taken deeper. The words came out soft, almost broken. She asked what he meant, who had taken him, but Daniel shut his mouth firmly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he whispered that the forest did not let go of everyone, only some. Sarah wrote the words down carefully, aware that they were the first clear glimpse into what had happened. Yet the answers raised more questions than they solved. She asked if anyone else had been there, if he had seen people, lights, or structures. He hesitated, and then said there were sounds, voices far off, and a light that did not belong to the sun or moon. Beyond that, he refused to go further. His breathing grew shallow, and his eyes darted to the corners of the room as if something might be listening. Sarah closed her notebook and reassured him that no one else was there, that he was safe. Daniel looked at her for the first time directly, his eyes hollow but steady. He said safety was not possible, not after what they had seen. Before she could ask more, he fell silent again, retreating into himself. The interview ended with more silence than truth, yet Sarah knew the investigation had shifted. The vanishing was no longer a mystery of lost hikers. It was something deeper, something that still frightened a man who had just returned after 10 lost years. Detective Sarah Holloway had always trusted records more than rumors, so when Daniel's strange words left her with more questions than answers, she turned to the archives. The ranger station on the edge of town held decades of files stacked in metal cabinets that smelled of dust and old paper. She signed her name in the visitor log, a formality no one really enforced, and pulled open a drawer labeled 1970s. The folders inside sagged with age, some of them torn, others stained by years of damp air. She sat at a wooden table beneath a buzzing light and began to read. At first the reports were ordinary. Notes about broken fences, injured hikers, and small forest fires. But as she read further back, the pages began to shift in tone. One ranger in particular, a man named Howard Keller, had filled his logs with unusual details. He wrote about strange lights in the trees at night, voices carried on the wind when no one else was nearby, and campers who left suddenly without checking out at the station. His words were brief, but carried unease. He seemed careful about how much he admitted on the official forms, as though afraid of being dismissed. Sarah kept flipping through the pages, her pulse quickening when she found Keller's private notes clipped inside a folder. The handwriting was hurried, almost desperate, and the lines were more direct than the formal reports. He wrote that some disappearances were never explained, that men and women walked into the pines and never returned. He mentioned tunnels hidden beneath the cliffs near the northern ridge, passages he believed were not natural. One note ended with a sentence that trailed off mid-thought, as though he had been interrupted. It read, "The deeper ones are still active," and the rest was left blank. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the words. The year was 1973, decades before Daniel and Marcus ever set foot on the trail. Yet Keller had described the same silence in the forest, the same sense of being watched. He had written of dogs losing scents at the same location where Daniel and Marcus were last tracked. The pattern was too exact to ignore. Sarah searched for Keller's later reports, but found none. The logs showed another ranger's name starting in 1974. When she asked the clerk about him, the older woman behind the desk shook her head. She remembered Keller vaguely, said he had left the job suddenly. No explanation, no forwarding address. Sarah pressed, but there was nothing more to tell. It was as if he too had slipped into the trees and vanished. She copied the notes and folded them carefully into her own file. The evidence was thin, but the thread stretched across time. Families had been left with questions for generations, and the official accounts had covered them with words like unresolved and inconclusive. Now Daniel's return carried all those old suspicions into the present. Sarah felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders as she locked the folder. If Keller's warnings were true, the forest had been keeping its secrets for far longer than anyone had admitted, and Daniel's silence was not the first, only the latest. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the hospital machines. Daniel sat upright in his bed, his back pressed stiffly against the headboard, as if the wall itself was the only thing keeping him steady. Detective Sarah Halloway sat across from him, her notebook open but her pen resting still. She had learned that forcing him to talk only closed him further, so she waited, giving him the silence he seemed to need. His hands trembled in his lap, his fingers twisting the fabric of the blanket until it was knotted. For days, Daniel had avoided direct answers, retreating behind half-sentences and long pauses. But tonight, something in him seemed to crack. His eyes darted toward the window, where the last trace of daylight clung to the horizon. He whispered that he hated the dark, his voice catching, almost childlike. Sarah leaned forward, encouraging him gently, telling him he was safe here. He shook his head, his lips tightening as if safety was a word he could no longer believe in. He began to speak in fragments, words spilling out unevenly. He said the forest had swallowed them, that the trail had stretched on forever, though they never seemed to climb higher or descend lower. He described lights flickering between the trees, not like fireflies, not like lanterns, but something colder, brighter, that appeared and vanished too quickly. His breathing grew uneven as he spoke, his voice trembling. He said they had followed the lights at first, thinking they belonged to someone else, someone who could help them, but they only led deeper. Sarah asked about Marcus. At the mention of the name, Daniel's face twisted with something raw. His eyes filled, his jaw clenched, and his hands shook harder. He whispered that Marcus had been taken, dragged further into the dark where Daniel could not follow. Sarah pressed carefully, asking who or what had taken him, but Daniel's words tumbled out in panic. He said he had heard voices in the distance, low and chanting, though he could not understand them. He said shadows moved between the trees, larger than men, and that Marcus had shouted once before the sound was cut off. Sarah placed her hand lightly on the edge of the bed, grounding him with her presence, reminding him he was not back there, he was here. Daniel's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and then his voice cracked entirely. He said Marcus had called his name, but he had run instead of turning back. He buried his face in his hands as the words broke free, saying he should have gone after him, should have fought, but fear had swallowed him whole. Tears slid down his face, his shoulders shaking as he repeated that Marcus was gone because of him. Sarah did not write then. She only let him speak until the weight of his guilt exhausted him. At last he slumped back against the pillows, drained, his voice falling to a whisper. He said the forest kept what it wanted, and it had wanted Marcus. Sarah left the room later with her notebook closed, her thoughts heavy. Daniel had not given her proof, only fragments, but fragments were enough to show her the truth he carried. Whatever had happened out there had broken him, and though his body had returned, part of him was still lost in the dark where Marcus had vanished. The morning was gray when Detective Sarah Halloway led a small team back into the forest. Daniel had given them directions in fragments, pointing to places on the map with an unsteady hand, but always circling back to the cliffs near the northern ridge. He had said little more, only that the truth was buried there. Sarah walked at the front of the group, her boots crunching over the carpet of pine needles, her mind racing with the notes she had copied from the old ranger files. The trail grew narrower as they climbed. The air grew cooler, and a thin mist clung to the branches, muting the sound of their steps. Daniel's warnings echoed in her head, his broken words about lights and voices, but she kept her focus steady. They reached the base of the ridge by midday. The rock face loomed above them, jagged and stained with moss. At first it looked solid and untouched, but as they spread out to search, one of the officers called out sharply. Sarah hurried over. Behind a cluster of brush, half buried by dirt and stone, was a collapsed opening. It looked like the mouth of an old tunnel, its wooden supports rotted and broken. She crouched low, brushing away leaves, and saw the ground littered with scraps of fabric, torn and faded. Nearby lay a rusted buckle, the kind that might once have belonged to a backpack strap. The sight froze her in place. This was no ordinary part of the trail. They cleared more of the debris, pulling free branches and loose stones until a small gap yawned wide enough to look through. The air that seeped out was cold, carrying the smell of damp earth and decay. A beam of light from a flashlight swept across the hollow inside. What it revealed silenced the group. Scattered along the dirt floor were bones, half hidden in mud, others resting on the surface as though they had been left in haste. Some were small, no more than fragments, while others lay almost intact. Sarah steadied her breath, kneeling closer. Mixed among the bones were objects that told their own story. A boot with its sole torn away, a cracked enamel mug, the corner of a flannel shirt still clinging to a rib cage. It was not one body, not two, but many, layered together in the earth. The forest had not simply hidden them, it had buried them beneath the ridge, out of sight, where time itself had kept them silent. One of the younger officers turned away, shaken. Sarah remained where she was, her hand pressed to the cold stone wall, her mind catching up to the scale of what they had found. These were not accidents or lost hikers. This was deliberate. This was a burial ground. She marked the site, calling for forensic teams to begin careful recovery. As the others moved back to set up equipment, Sarah lingered at the opening. The silence inside the hollow pressed against her ears, heavy and unbroken. She thought of Daniel's words again, how he had said the forest kept what it wanted. Standing there, she believed him. The truth was no longer a question of if the forest had taken people, but how many it had chosen to keep. The town reacted to Daniel's return with a mixture of wonder and unease. At first there were whispers of miracle and survival. His name passed quickly from one porch to another, but soon the whispers thinned into silence. People avoided speaking too loudly, as though even the sound of his story might call something back from the woods. In the diner on Main Street, where locals usually gathered to share news, conversations shifted when his name was mentioned. Someone would cough, someone else would change the subject, and the quiet would settle again like dust. Detective Sarah Holloway noticed it almost at once, when she asked about the missing ranger Howard Keller, or about strange lights seen years ago. She was met with polite smiles and vague answers. Shopkeepers shrugged, saying they remembered nothing. Older residents looked away, their expressions tight as though she had broken an unspoken rule. It was not that they did not know, but that they had agreed long ago not to speak of it. The silence seemed practiced, carried down like a tradition. Daniel's family experienced it too. When his parents went to the market, neighbors greeted them kindly but without warmth, their eyes sliding past as if afraid to linger. Some even crossed the street. It was not cruelty, but fear disguised as distance. The town did not want to be reminded of what the forest could do. To them, Daniel's return was not a gift, but a warning. He was proof that the woods kept secrets, and no one wanted those secrets close to home. Sarah tried again, attending a small community meeting held in the town hall. She stood at the back, listening as residents discussed repairs to the old bridge and plans for the autumn fair. When the floor opened for questions, she raised her voice and asked directly about disappearances in past decades. The room fell silent, every head turning briefly before someone at the front cleared his throat and said only that people sometimes got lost, that it was nothing more. The meeting ended soon after, and as people filed past her, not one met her eyes. That night she walked down the main street alone. The windows were lit but curtains were drawn. A place that should have felt warm and familiar seemed instead like a town holding its breath. She thought of Daniel in his hospital bed, whispering that the forest kept what it wanted, and she realized the townspeople believed it too. Their silence was not ignorance, it was protection. Speaking aloud would mean admitting that something lived in those woods, something they had never been able to stop. By the end of the week, Sarah wrote in her notes that the town itself was a barrier. She could investigate records, search the forest, and question Daniel, but the people who had lived with the mystery the longest had chosen to bury it. Their silence was a wall built higher with every passing year. As she closed her notebook, she understood that breaking through that wall might be harder than entering the forest itself. Daniel had been restless all day, his hands fidgeting with the edges of the blanket, his gaze fixed on the corner of the hospital room as though something waited there. By evening, when the hallways had quieted and the sound of passing carts faded, he finally spoke. His voice was low, strained, carrying the weight of someone who had been holding back too much for too long. Detective Sarah Holloway sat beside his bed, her notebook resting closed on her lap. She had learned that the less pressure she applied, the more Daniel revealed. He said the forest had let him go for a reason. The words hung in the air, unsettling in their certainty. Sarah asked what he meant, but Daniel shook his head, his eyes darting again to the shadowed corner. He whispered that it was not done, that something in those woods was watching even now. His tone was not dramatic, not meant to scare, but steady with conviction, as though he were repeating a fact. Sarah leaned forward, careful with her questions. She asked if the forest wanted Marcus, if that was why he had not returned. Daniel's eyes filled with fear, and he gripped the blanket tighter. He said Marcus had been taken because he saw too much. The forest, he explained haltingly, was not empty, and those who vanished were not simply lost. He paused, breathing heavily, and then added that people should stop searching, that the ground itself was a trap. Sarah's mind raced. She had read Keller's old files, the warnings buried in the ranger notes, but hearing the same fear in Daniel's voice made the past feel painfully alive. She asked why the forest had allowed him to return, why he was different. His face tightened and he shook his head again. He said he did not know, only that he had been spared so he could tell others not to go back. Then his voice dropped, trembling. He said if people ignored the warning, more would vanish, and next time none would come back. The room felt colder, though the radiator hummed steadily in the corner. Sarah studied him, trying to read whether his words were fear alone or truth woven with experience. Daniel met her eyes then, his expression fragile but fierce. He said the burial ground they had uncovered was only part of it. There were more places, deeper places, and if they kept digging, they would awaken what should have been left in silence. For the first time since meeting him, Sarah felt a flicker of unease she could not push away. She had seen bodies unearthed, objects belonging to the vanished, yet Daniel's words carried something heavier than evidence. They carried belief. He was not pleading for himself, but for everyone else. He repeated the same phrase quietly, almost like a chant. Do not go back. Do not go back. Sarah left the hospital that night unsettled. She had gone in hoping for answers, but instead she carried away a warning, one that echoed louder in her thoughts with each step she took away from the building. The town had chosen silence, but Daniel's voice had broken it, leaving her with the uneasy sense that the story was far from over and the forest was not finished. The abandoned ranger outpost stood just as Daniel had described it, weathered boards sagging under the weight of moss, windows clouded and cracked, the doorway leaning slightly as though one more storm might bring it down. Detective Sarah Holloway paused at the tree line, studying the building as the wind moved softly through the branches above. The place carried an unsettling stillness, as if it had been waiting all these years for someone to return. Behind her, 2 officers kept their distance, uneasy about stepping closer. Sarah moved forward, her boots crunching over layers of pine needles. She circled the outpost, tracing the lines of the structure with her flashlight even in the daylight. The front steps groaned under her weight, and the air inside the building was colder than outside, carrying the smell of damp wood and earth. Dust coated everything, but on the floor near the back wall she noticed a patch of dirt disturbed, darker than the rest, as if something had been moved or buried there recently. She crouched, running her hand over the spot, and felt the wood beneath sag slightly. She pressed harder, and the board shifted under her palm. Calling the officers forward, they pried at the boards together until a section came loose with a sharp crack. Beneath it was not soil, as she had expected, but a shallow cavity lined with stones. At first it appeared empty, only darkness beneath. But as her light passed over it, shapes emerged. A metal canteen, dented and rusted. A torn scrap of fabric that looked like the corner of a flannel shirt. And deeper, half hidden by dirt, the edge of a boot. Sarah's chest tightened as she realized what they had uncovered. This was not just an outpost. It had been used as a place to conceal what the forest had claimed. One of the officers muttered nervously that they should leave it sealed until the forensic team arrived. Sarah agreed, marking the site carefully and stepping back. But even as they covered the boards again, she could not ignore the feeling that the outpost itself was more than a shelter, more than an old building falling into ruin. It was part of the pattern. The burial ground near the ridge, the vanished ranger who had left notes warning of hidden tunnels, and now this, a structure tied directly to the disappearances. She looked around the room once more. The windows let in thin light, just enough to illuminate the carvings etched faintly into the wall near the door. Circles, lines, crude marks cut long ago. Sarah leaned close, brushing dust away, and saw they matched the strange symbols she had copied from Keller's private notes. It was proof that he had been here, that he had seen the same warnings. The officers shifted uneasily, their voices low as they urged her to leave. The silence pressing against the old wood felt heavier the longer they stayed. Sarah finally stepped back outside, drawing in fresh air as though surfacing from deep water. The outpost stood behind her, quiet once more, but now it was no longer only an abandoned building in the woods. It was a doorway into the mystery itself, a place that held fragments of those who never returned. As they hiked back toward the main trail, Sarah felt the weight of what she had seen pressing harder than before. Daniel's words returned to her mind. The forest keeps what it wants. She knew then the outpost was not just a ruin, but a marker of how long the forest had been keeping its secrets. The entrance to the caves was hidden at the base of the northern ridge, half concealed by tangled brush and fallen rock. Detective Sarah Halloway stood before it in the fading light, the memory of Daniel's warning still sharp in her mind. "Do not go back," he had said again and again. Yet here she was, her flashlight in one hand, her other resting on the cool stone as if steadying herself against what lay ahead. Two officers followed close behind, their voices low, their unease plain. None of them liked the silence that pressed so heavily around the cave mouth. The opening was narrow, forcing them to crouch as they entered. The air grew colder at once, carrying the damp smell of earth that had not seen light in decades. Their footsteps echoed off stone walls, the sound too loud in the enclosed space. Sarah swept her light across the floor, seeing deep grooves cut into the dirt as though heavy objects had been dragged inside long ago. The tunnel widened after a few yards, leading into a hollow chamber. Here, the ceiling arched high above, dripping with moisture, and the ground was scattered with fragments of wood and rusted metal. At first glance, it looked like old mining debris, but as Sarah crouched, she saw something else. A broken lantern lay beside a decayed scrap of fabric. Near the wall, half buried in mud, was the outline of a human shoe. The sight drew a sharp breath from the younger officer, who quickly crossed himself before stepping back. Sarah pressed forward, her beam sliding across the walls. She stopped suddenly when she noticed markings etched into the stone, circles, jagged lines, and symbols she recognized from Keller's notes. They were faint but deliberate, carved deep into the rock. She touched them with her gloved hand, her mind racing. These were not natural, and they were not new. Someone had been here, leaving warnings or messages that no one had read in time. Deeper inside, the tunnel forked, one passage descending steeply, the other curving toward a darker hollow. A faint draft came from below, carrying with it a sound so soft Sarah at first thought it was her imagination. A low murmur, like distant voices, echoing faintly through the stone. She raised her hand to halt the officers, listening closely. The sound faded, replaced by dripping water, but the unease lingered. They explored the side chamber first. Here, the ground sloped gently, and the walls narrowed until the three of them had to move single file. At the end, they found another cavity, this one containing a pile of stones deliberately arranged. Sarah crouched again, her light revealing what lay between the rocks. Small bones, brittle and pale, pressed together with scraps of cloth. The officers looked away, but Sarah stayed focused. This was not natural collapse. It was placement. It was burial. She marked the location, her voice steady, though her chest felt tight. The cave was more than a hollow in the ridge. It was part of a system, a place used to hide what the forest had taken. As she turned back toward the entrance, she could not stop thinking of Daniel's words. The forest keeps what it wants. Now, she knew, the caves kept them too. The room was dim when Daniel finally spoke of Marcus. The blinds pulled halfway down, the pale evening light falling across his face. For days he had resisted, shaking his head whenever the name came up, but on this night his voice broke through the silence. He told Detective Sarah Halloway that Marcus had not simply vanished, and that what had taken him was not something he could fight or follow. His words came haltingly, his hands twisting in his lap, as though saying them aloud brought the moment back too clearly. He described how they had wandered off the trail, drawn by the strange lights that glowed faintly between the trees. At first, they thought it might be another camp or a ranger's lantern, but the lights never stayed still. They drifted deeper, always just out of reach, leading them away from the familiar path. Marcus had grown uneasy, telling Daniel they should turn back, but the forest had already pressed in around them, its silence heavy, the trail gone. Daniel said that one night, as they rested near a hollow, the air shifted. It felt charged, thick, as though the whole forest was waiting. Then they heard voices, low and steady, not close but not far either, echoing in a rhythm that made no sense. Marcus had stood first, straining to hear. His face was pale but determined. Daniel begged him not to move, but Marcus said they could not sit forever, that someone must be out there. When Marcus stepped forward, Daniel followed, but the shadows between the trees moved differently. He said figures appeared, not clearly seen, but sensed, shapes darker than the night around them. The voices grew louder, and before Daniel could pull him back, Marcus was gone, dragged into the dark with a cry that ended too quickly. Daniel stumbled after, but the forest closed around him, the path shifting, the air pressing down until he could not breathe. He said he had searched, calling Marcus's name until his voice cracked, but the silence had swallowed it. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, the trees twisting until he no longer knew where he was. He remembered falling, crawling, then nothing more. When he woke again, Marcus was gone, and the forest was silent as if nothing had ever happened. Daniel stopped speaking then, his body shaking, his eyes fixed on the floor. Sarah wrote nothing, sensing that the truth he had given was already costing him more than he could bear. Marcus's fate was clear, though unspoken. He had been taken, consumed by whatever presence lingered in those woods, and Daniel had carried the guilt of survival ever since. The room stayed quiet for a long time, the faint hum of the machines, the only sound. Sarah understood then that Marcus had become more than just another missing person. His disappearance was part of something older, a pattern stretching back decades, and Daniel's return was not a rescue but a warning. The cave was colder the deeper they went, the air damp and thick with the smell of stone. Detective Sarah Halloway held her flashlight steady, its narrow beam cutting through the dark ahead. Behind her, the two officers followed in silence, their own lights trembling slightly as they swept over the uneven walls. The passage curved, the ceiling pressing lower, forcing them to stoop as they moved. Every sound echoed, every step magnified until it felt as though the cave itself was listening. Sarah kept her focus on the ground, where the dirt was marked by grooves, long and deliberate, as if heavy loads had been dragged through the tunnel. They were not fresh, but they were clear enough to follow. The trail ended at a wide hollow, and when she raised her light, her chest tightened. Stacked against the stone wall were wooden crates, rotted and broken with age, but still intact enough to be recognized. She approached carefully, brushing away layers of dirt and moss with her glove. The wood splintered under her touch, and inside she saw fragments of fabric, a rusted tin cup, and bones pale against the dark soil. Her breath caught. It was the proof she had expected but dreaded, the undeniable sign that people had been brought here and hidden. She felt the weight of Daniel's words settle over her again, his warning that the forest kept what it wanted. One of the officers muttered nervously, saying they should leave at once, but Sarah stayed. She lifted a strip of cloth from the dirt, its pattern faint but visible, the red and black of a flannel shirt. The detail matched the old missing persons reports she had read. It was not imagination, not rumor. The past was here in front of her. On the far side of the chamber, her light caught something else. Symbols carved deep into the stone, the same circles and jagged lines she had seen before, but clearer here, sharper, as though someone had spent hours cutting them into the wall. The officers shifted uneasily, their whispers low. Sarah stepped closer, running her hand over the grooves. The markings felt cold beneath her glove, the stone slick with moisture. She realized then that these were not random carvings but warnings, or perhaps rituals, left by whoever had used the cave. The silence pressed down heavier as they stood there, the faint drip of water, the only sound. Sarah took photographs quickly, knowing this was the evidence she needed, the kind that could no longer be dismissed as stories. She documented the crates, the bones, the symbols, each image proof that the disappearances had not been accidents. But as she lowered the camera, a faint sound reached her ears. Not water, not footsteps, but something else. A whisper, low and indistinct, drifting through the stone. She froze, straining to hear. The officers looked at her with wide eyes, both having heard it too. It faded quickly, swallowed by the cave, but the dread it left behind was real. Sarah steadied her breath and signaled to move back. They carried with them more than evidence now. They carried the knowledge that the forest's silence was not empty, and that whatever had taken Marcus and so many others was not only in the past. The proof lay in the dark, and it was alive. The storm had rolled in quickly, clouds pressing low against the ridge as Detective Sarah Holloway and her team made their way back through the caves. The evidence they had gathered weighed heavily on her mind, not just in the photographs and samples secured in her bag, but in the knowledge that they had stepped too far into something the forest wanted hidden. The air in the tunnels seemed to tighten around them, their flashlights flickering in the damp dark as if the stone itself were breathing. Sarah urged the officers to keep moving, their boots striking against uneven ground, but every sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing back in distorted fragments. Then, faint at first, came the whispering. It was the same low murmur they had heard before, carrying through the walls in a rhythm that almost resembled language. The youngest officer froze, his light shaking wildly, insisting that someone was following. Sarah's instincts told her to run, though her mind screamed to remain steady. They pressed forward, turning into a narrow passage that sloped upward. The ground grew slick with water, and one of the officers slipped, his cry echoing sharply. The whispering surged louder in response, surrounding them, growing into a chorus of sounds that made the cave vibrate. Sarah grabbed the fallen man, dragging him to his feet, her voice low but firm as she ordered them to move faster. As they climbed, the air grew thinner, colder, until a faint glow appeared ahead. At first Sarah thought it was daylight, but the light pulsed strangely, pale and shifting, not like the Sunday. She forced herself not to look at it directly, focusing instead on the rough edges of the stone. They reached a wider hollow where the passage split again, and for a moment uncertainty nearly rooted them in place. Behind them the whispers pressed closer, almost human, almost calling. Sarah made the choice quickly, pulling them toward the left path where she felt the air moving. The glow followed faintly but began to fade as they pushed further. Finally, with a sudden rush, the passage widened into an opening. Cold night air struck them, sharp and real, carrying the clean smell of pine. They stumbled out into the forest, the storm winds whipping at their faces. Behind them the cave mouth yawned like a wound in the ridge, the sounds inside dying away the instant they left its shadow. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They stood in the clearing, breathing hard, their flashlights now weak in the storm. Sarah looked back once, her chest tightening as she realized how close they had come to joining the silence of the others. The forest loomed around them, endless, indifferent, yet she felt its gaze even in the storm. They made their way down the ridge in silence, each step heavy, every crack of thunder above reminding them of what they had escaped. For Sarah, it was clear this was no victory, only survival. The forest had let them go, just as it had let Daniel go years before, and that truth unsettled her most of all. If it chose who returned, then this escape was not theirs. It was granted. The news spread faster than Sarah Holloway had imagined. Within days of leaving the forest, the photographs, the reports, and the physical evidence were in the hands of state authorities. What had once been whispered stories or brushed aside as old tragedies were suddenly undeniable. Images of the burial ground, the crates in the caves, and the strange markings carved into stone filled newspapers and television screens. The town, which had once hidden behind silence, could no longer look away. Reporters swarmed the streets, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Some residents shut their doors, refusing to speak, while others admitted quietly that they had always known something was wrong in the woods. They told stories of family members who had gone missing, of nights when lights flickered deep between the trees, of ranger reports that had been filed and forgotten. The collective silence that had stretched over decades fractured at last, giving way to a wave of fear and sorrow. For Daniel, the attention was unbearable. He had survived, but survival had left him marked. He avoided the cameras, speaking only briefly through Sarah, and made it clear he wanted no part in the spectacle. He said the evidence was enough, that the world needed to see it, but he himself had no strength left to relive it again. The guilt he carried was too heavy, yet his return had become the key that finally forced the truth into the light. Investigators descended on the forest, mapping the caves, unearthing remains, and cataloging artifacts. Each discovery only confirmed what Sarah had already known. The disappearances were not isolated accidents but part of a long, deliberate pattern, stretching back generations. The old ranger's notes were re-examined, his warnings finally recognized for what they were. The caves and the outpost were sealed, not as forgotten ruins, but as evidence in an inquiry that promised to last for years. The town itself changed. A memorial was raised near the ridge, a simple stone wall with the names of those who had vanished. Families who had lived with silence for decades finally had a place to grieve openly. Flowers appeared along the wall, photographs tucked into corners, candles lit at dusk. For some, the truth brought comfort, but for others, it reopened wounds that had never healed. The legacy of the forest was no longer mystery but tragedy, and the town would carry it forever. For Sarah, the case became more than an investigation. It was a reminder that truth had to be fought for, even when others turned away. She knew the forest still held secrets, and that not every question would ever be answered, but exposing what had been hidden was enough. The silence had been broken. When she returned to the ridge months later, the air was quiet and the trees swayed in the wind. The caves were sealed, guarded by new fences, but she stood there for a long time, remembering Daniel's warning and Marcus's fate. She knew the forest would always keep part of its darkness, but now the world knew it too, and that knowledge, painful as it was, became the legacy left behind.